Ever heard of the man who became a doctor, a prison warden, a monk, a psychologist, a professor, and dozens of other people? Sometimes, in the same year, he convinced hospitals, universities, governments, even the military, that he was someone else. Again and again. His name was Ferdinand Demara, and he may have been the greatest impostor in history. This is the story of the man who proved that confidence can sometimes be more convincing than credentials. Most criminals steal money. Some steal power. Ferdinand Demara stole something much stranger. Entire identities. Not for a few hours. Not for a weekend. Sometimes for months. Sometimes long enough to convince experts they had known him for years. The remarkable part wasn't that he lied. People lie every day. The remarkable part was how often people believed him. Doctors trusted him. Professors trusted him. Government officials trusted him. Even people whose entire job was verifying identities trusted him. Again and again. His life sounds like fiction. It wasn't. And every time you think you've reached the most unbelievable part, another one appears. Chapter 1. The boy who refused to be ordinary. Long before Ferdinand Demara became one of history's greatest impostors, he was simply a boy growing up in Massachusetts. At first, there was nothing to suggest he would spend his life pretending to be other people. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't a famous prodigy. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't even particularly interested in breaking the law. What fascinated him was something far more unusual: reinvention. Most people spend their lives trying to discover who they are. Demara seemed more interested in discovering who he could become. From an early age, he possessed an extraordinary memory. He absorbed information quickly, read constantly, and developed an unusual confidence in his ability to learn almost anything. Not eventually. Quickly. Very quickly. School came easily. Conversation came easily. Winning people's trust came even easier. He had a gift. Not for deception. At least, not yet. For becoming believable. It was a subtle difference. One that would define the rest of his life. Because Ferdinand Demara understood something long before psychologists began studying it. People rarely question confidence. Question uncertainty? All the time. Question confidence? Much less often. If someone speaks with certainty, carries themselves with authority, appears to belong, most people accept them without much thought. Demara noticed this. And once he noticed it, he couldn't stop noticing it. Life, he realized, was full of invisible doors. Most people never opened them. Not because they were locked. Because they assumed they weren't allowed. Demara had a different philosophy. Try the handle. Sometimes, the door opens. As he grew older, that curiosity became ambition. Ordinary life didn't interest him. Ordinary jobs didn't interest him. Ordinary expectations felt, well, ordinary. He wanted adventure. Challenge. A bigger story. The problem was that becoming extraordinary usually requires years of work. Years of education. Years of experience. Years of patience. Demara wasn't very interested in patience. He preferred shortcuts. Not lazy shortcuts. Creative ones. If the front door took 10 years, perhaps there was another entrance. At first, the idea was harmless. Almost playful. What if people believed he was someone else? Just for a little while. Just to see if it worked. Surely nobody would actually believe him. They did. And once Ferdinand Demara discovered how surprisingly easy it could be to step into another person's life, there was no going back. Because pretending to be someone else was exciting. But becoming them, that was addictive. Most people spend years building a reputation. Ferdinand Demara was about to discover something astonishing. Sometimes, you could borrow one. And if people believed the story, they rarely asked many questions. That realization would take him far beyond Massachusetts. Into monasteries, military bases, hospitals, universities, and eventually, into one of the most unbelievable careers in modern history. Chapter 2. Stealing a New Life. At some point, curiosity became action. Ferdinand Demara stopped imagining different lives. He started living them. Not all at once. Not dramatically. One identity at a time. At first, the changes were relatively small. A different name. A different background. A different story. Enough to become someone new. Surely people would ask difficult questions. They rarely did. That surprised him. And once Ferdinand Demara realized how little most people verified, his ambitions grew. Because confidence has a strange effect on human psychology. When someone appears to belong, we usually assume they do. We notice the uniform, the title, the introduction, and our minds quietly fill in the rest. Demara understood this instinct long before psychologists gave it a name. He didn't try to convince people. He behaved as though they were already convinced. Oddly enough, they usually were. One false identity became another. One opportunity became the next. Each success made the next impersonation feel a little less impossible. He worked in religious communities, educational institutions, government organizations. Each new role sounded more ambitious than the last. Each one should have exposed him. Instead, they opened another door. Imagine meeting a man who introduces himself as a professor. You don't immediately ask to see his diploma. Imagine shaking hands with someone wearing an officer's uniform. You don't usually demand their personnel file. Most of us begin with trust. Verification comes later. If it comes at all. Demara built an entire life inside that gap. And perhaps the strangest part was this. He wasn't obsessed with money. He wasn't chasing luxury. He wasn't building a criminal empire. He seemed fascinated by the experience itself. Could he become someone else? Could he learn fast enough? Could he survive inside another person's life? To Ferdinand Demara, every new identity was almost like solving a puzzle. Sometimes the puzzle lasted weeks. Sometimes months. Occasionally, much longer. Friends accepted him. Colleagues respected him. Supervisors promoted him. Again and again, people saw exactly what they expected to see. A capable professional. A knowledgeable expert. A man who clearly belonged. Few stopped to ask the obvious question. How do we know? The answer was surprisingly simple. Because nobody else was asking either. That may have been Demara's greatest discovery. People often assume someone else has already checked. Someone in human resources. Someone in government. Someone higher up. Someone more qualified. As long as everyone believes another person verified the story. Sometimes no one verifies it at all. It sounds ridiculous. Until you remember how often it worked. And for Ferdinand Demara, it worked remarkably well. But every successful performance creates a dangerous temptation. To attempt an even bigger one. Soon, pretending to be a teacher or an administrator would no longer be enough. Demara wanted a greater challenge. One so outrageous that no reasonable person would ever attempt it. Naturally, he did. The interview. Imagine you're interviewing a candidate for an important position. They arrive on time. They're well dressed, confident, friendly. Every answer sounds convincing. They speak naturally. They ask thoughtful questions. By the end of the conversation, you already picture them working with your team. One small thought crosses your mind. I should probably double-check their references. Then another meeting starts. The phone rings. Someone else says they'll handle it. The paperwork gets delayed. Days become weeks. Eventually, the candidate becomes an employee. Not because anyone confirmed the story. Because everyone assumed someone else already had. Sometimes, trust isn't earned. It's inherited. And Ferdinand Demara understood that better than almost anyone. By now, Ferdinand Demara had learned something extraordinary. People rarely believed his identities because they were perfect. They believed them because they expected them to be true. That realization would soon lead him to his most unbelievable impersonation yet. One that would place human lives in his hands. Literally. Chapter 3. The man who could do any job. By now, Ferdinand Demara had stopped asking himself a simple question. Can I do this? Instead, he asked a different one. Can I learn it fast enough? To most people, those questions sound almost identical. They aren't. The first assumes ability comes before opportunity. The second assumes opportunity comes first. Demara believed almost anything could be learned. Especially if people believed you already knew it. So he kept changing identities. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. One day, he might be working in a religious community. Another day, an educational institution. Later, a government office. Every new role became another experiment. How far could confidence really take a person? The answer, it seemed, farther than anyone expected. One of the strangest parts of Demara's story was how quickly he adapted. He wasn't pretending to know everything. He was constantly reading, studying, observing, asking careful questions without making them sound like questions. He learned on the move. If a job required new knowledge, he found a book. If someone expected expertise, he stayed up all night learning just enough to sound convincing the next morning. It wasn't magic. It was preparation. Very fast preparation. Combined with extraordinary confidence. Of course, mistakes happened. No one could successfully impersonate professionals forever without attracting suspicion. But Demara had an unusual talent. When problems appeared, he rarely panicked. He improvised. Sometimes brilliantly. Sometimes ridiculously. Often both. Imagine discovering you've accepted a position requiring knowledge you don't actually possess. Most people would resign immediately. Demara bought textbooks and started reading. Imagine being asked a difficult question by an expert. Most people would freeze. Demara answered confidently. Then quietly spent the evening learning why his answer had sounded believable. It was an extraordinary way to live. Exhausting. Risky. Completely unsustainable. Or so everyone assumed. Yet somehow, he kept succeeding. Again. And again. The more impossible the role seemed, the more interested he became. It wasn't enough to fool one person anymore. He wanted to fool institutions. Entire organizations. People whose careers depended on recognizing expertise. And somehow, many of them accepted him. Not because Ferdinand Demara was the smartest man in every room, but because he understood something surprisingly simple. People expect experts to act confidently. So he did. People expect authority to look comfortable. So he looked comfortable. People expect professionals to belong. So he behaved as though he already did. Most of the time. That was enough. But eventually, confidence encounters a problem no amount of charm can solve. Reality. Because sooner or later, someone was going to ask Ferdinand Demara to do something that couldn't be improvised. Something that required genuine expertise. Something with real consequences. Most impostors would have run. Demara accepted the job. The office door. Imagine walking down a long hallway. Every door has a title. Manager. Professor. Director. Chief. You stop in front of one marked Authorized personnel only. Most people keep walking. They assume they don't belong. Now imagine opening the door anyway. You smile. Introduce yourself. Shake a few hands. Answer questions confidently. Before long, people begin treating you as though you've always worked there. Not because they recognize you. Because everyone assumes someone else already does. Sometimes, the hardest part of entering the room is convincing yourself to turn the handle. Ferdinand Demara built an entire life on that idea. By now, Ferdinand Demara had impersonated enough professionals to convince himself of something remarkable. Almost every role had a learning curve. The question was whether he could survive it. Soon, he would test that theory in the most dangerous way imaginable. By becoming a doctor. A decision that should have ended his story. Instead, it made him famous. Chapter 4. The Fake Surgeon. Of all Ferdinand Demara's impersonations, one stands above the rest. Not because it was the longest. Not because it was the most profitable. Because people's lives depended on it. In the early 1950s, Demara joined the Royal Canadian Navy. Not under his own name. Under someone else's. He assumed the identity of a physician. A naval surgeon. On paper, he was exactly who everyone expected. In reality, he had never attended medical school. It sounds like the beginning of a disaster. Many historians assumed it would be. Then something unexpected happened. War broke out in Korea. Casualties began arriving. Real patients. Real injuries. Real emergencies. The moment every impostor fears had arrived. Surely this was where Ferdinand Demara's story finally ended. It didn't. Instead of running, he opened a medical textbook. Then another. Then another. He studied anatomy. Surgical procedures. Emergency medicine. Anything he could find. Hour after hour. Page after page. Then he did something almost impossible to believe. He performed surgery. Not once. Multiple times. According to historical accounts, he relied heavily on surgical manuals, consulted medical references whenever possible, and worked methodically through each procedure. The operations were successful. The patients recovered. His colleagues praised his work. Some even described him as calm under pressure. Imagine that for a moment. A man with no formal medical degree, being complimented on his surgical ability. The story sounds invented. It isn't. How was it possible? Part of the answer lies in preparation. Demara absorbed enormous amounts of information in very little time. Another part lies in teamwork. Medicine was never a one-man performance. Experienced nurses, medical assistants, standard procedures, all help reduce risk. And part of the answer remains difficult to explain. Demara possessed an extraordinary ability to stay calm. While most people would have panicked, he focused. Read. Adapted. Solved one problem at a time. Eventually, the truth emerged. Not because a patient complained. Not because a surgery failed. Because someone recognized a photograph. The real doctor whose identity Demara had borrowed saw his picture in a newspaper. The deception was over. At last. The remarkable thing was what happened next. The patients he had treated weren't demanding revenge. Many were simply stunned. Because by every visible measure, the man had done his job. The Navy quietly removed him. The story spread rapidly. Newspapers couldn't resist it. A fake doctor. Successful operations. An international sensation. People across North America asked the same question. How could something like this happen? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just about Demara. It was about trust. Systems. Assumptions. The quiet belief that someone else has already verified everything. Demara hadn't defeated medicine. He had exposed something about human nature. Sometimes, people believe the uniform before they question the person wearing it. And that realization made his story far bigger than one extraordinary impersonation. It became a lesson, one the world still talks about today. The operating room. Imagine standing outside an operating room. The doors swing open. A surgeon walks in. Everyone immediately relaxes. The nurses know what to do. The assistants prepare their equipment. The patient places complete trust in a stranger. No one asks to see a diploma. No one requests exam results. Because that isn't how trust works. The white coat becomes the evidence. The title becomes the proof. Now imagine discovering years later that the surgeon wasn't who everyone believed. Suddenly, the room looks different. The equipment hasn't changed. The procedure hasn't changed. Only the story has. And sometimes, a different story changes everything. Most impostors disappear after being exposed. Ferdinand Demara became famous. Newspapers wanted interviews. The public couldn't believe the story. And strangely, neither could the people who had worked beside him. Because the greatest mystery was no longer how he fooled everyone. It was why he kept doing it. Chapter 5. How did he keep getting away with it? By now, the obvious question wasn't, who was Ferdinand Demara? It was, how did people keep believing him? Surely one successful deception could be explained by luck. 2 might be coincidence. 3 would be remarkable. But dozens? Across different professions, different institutions, different countries. At some point, luck stops being a satisfying answer. There had to be something more. Part of that answer was confidence. Real confidence. Not arrogance. Not loudness. The quiet confidence of someone who behaves as though they belong. Psychologists have long observed something interesting about authority. We don't evaluate it from scratch every time. We look for shortcuts. A uniform. A title. An office. A recommendation. If enough signals suggest someone is qualified, our brains often stop asking questions. Demara understood those signals instinctively. He didn't overact. He didn't try to impress everyone. He simply behaved like the person people already expected to meet. An expectation is surprisingly powerful. Imagine arriving at a university. Someone introduces themselves as the new professor. They shake your hand. They know the building. They speak confidently. Most people don't interrupt the conversation to ask for proof. Because the introduction itself feels like proof. Demara lived inside that assumption. Again. And again. Another reason his schemes succeeded was preparation. Popular culture sometimes portrays him as a man who simply walked into impossible jobs. The reality was more complicated. He studied constantly. Read obsessively. Learned at remarkable speed. Whenever he entered a new role, he absorbed as much information as possible. He wasn't pretending knowledge didn't matter. He simply believed it could be acquired faster than most people imagined. Sometimes, he was right. Perhaps the most important lesson, however, had nothing to do with Demara at all. It had to do with everyone around him. Large institutions often assume someone else has already done the checking. A supervisor trusts human resources. Human resources trusts previous documentation. Previous documentation relies on earlier assumptions. Responsibility quietly moves from person to person, until no one actually verifies anything. Psychologists sometimes call this the diffusion of responsibility. The more people involved, the less likely any one person feels responsible. Demara didn't invent that weakness. He discovered it, then walked straight through it. His story revealed something uncomfortable. Most systems depend on trust. Without trust, nothing functions efficiently. Hospitals, universities, governments, businesses. Every organization depends on people accepting that others have done their jobs. Most of the time, that trust works. Occasionally, someone like Ferdinand Demara appears. Not because the system is completely broken. Because no system can verify everything. That may be the strangest part of his legacy. He wasn't exposing individual failures. He was exposing human nature. Our tendency to trust, to assume, to believe. Especially when believing is easier than questioning. And once the newspapers understood that, Ferdinand Demara stopped being just another impostor. He became a phenomenon. The man everyone wanted to understand. The clipboard. Imagine walking into a busy office carrying nothing more than a clipboard. You move with purpose. You nod politely. You glance at paperwork as though you're expected. Nobody stops you. Why would they? You look like you belong. A few minutes later, someone asks if you need help. Not because they suspect you. Because they assume you're supposed to be there. The clipboard didn't grant authority. It suggested authority. And sometimes, suggestion is enough. Ferdinand Demara understood that appearances often answer questions before anyone thinks to ask them. By now, Ferdinand Demara had become an international curiosity. Newspapers couldn't get enough of him. Readers couldn't believe his story. Some admired his intelligence. Others condemned his deception. But almost everyone asked the same question. Why would someone with talents like his spend a lifetime pretending to be someone else? The answer was more complicated than anyone expected. Chapter 6. The Man Who Didn't Want to Be Himself. By now, Ferdinand Demara had become famous. Newspapers wrote about him. Magazines interviewed him. Television audiences wanted to see the man who had fooled the world. Most people assumed they already understood him. They thought he was chasing money. He wasn't. They thought he wanted power. Not really. They thought he wanted fame. That came later. If anything, fame made his life more difficult. The more recognizable he became, the harder it was to become someone else. So what was he actually chasing? Perhaps the experience itself. Demara seemed fascinated by possibility. Why live one life when you could live 20? Why spend years climbing one career ladder when you could start over whenever you became bored? To most people, that sounds exhausting. To Demara, it sounded exciting. Every new identity was a fresh beginning. A new challenge. A new puzzle to solve. Could he convince them? Could he learn quickly enough? Could he survive one more impossible situation? For him, the answer was rarely found in the destination. It was found in the attempt. Ironically, many people who met Demara described him as warm, funny, charming, even generous. He wasn't the cold, calculating criminal many expected. He enjoyed conversation. He enjoyed learning. He enjoyed making people laugh. That only made his story stranger. Because people expect impostors to be manipulative. Demara often seemed more curious than malicious. That doesn't excuse what he did. People trusted him. Institutions relied on him. He repeatedly assumed identities that were not his. Real risks existed. Real consequences existed. But understanding someone isn't the same as excusing them. And Ferdinand Demara remains difficult to categorize. He wasn't driven by greed. He wasn't driven by violence. He wasn't trying to conquer the world. He simply refused to remain one person for very long. Eventually, reality caught up with him. The identities became harder to maintain. His reputation spread. The newspapers had turned him into a celebrity. Ironically, the greatest impostor in history could no longer disappear. People recognized his face. The very thing that made him famous prevented him from becoming someone new. For the first time in years, Ferdinand Demara had to live as Ferdinand Demara. That may have been the hardest role he ever played. The mask. Imagine wearing a mask every day. At first, it's exciting. You become whoever you want. People treat you differently. New opportunities appear. The world feels full of possibilities. Then one day, everyone knows about the mask. They recognize it instantly. You can still put it on. But no one believes it anymore. For the first time. You have no choice but to remove it. The strange thing is, after wearing masks for so long, you may no longer be certain who is underneath. Perhaps that was Ferdinand Demara's greatest challenge. Not pretending to be someone else. Remembering how to be himself. Most anti-heroes built empires. Or fortunes. Or institutions. Ferdinand Demara left behind something much harder to measure. A question. How much of our identity comes from who we really are? And how much comes from what other people believe about us? That question would become the true legacy of the man who became everyone. Chapter 7. The Psychology of Belief. Long after Ferdinand Demara stopped stealing identities, people were still studying him. Not because they wanted to imitate him, because they wanted to understand him. Psychologists became interested. Sociologists became interested. Security experts became interested. How could one man convince so many intelligent people? The answer wasn't that everyone else was foolish. Far from it. Many of the people Demara deceived were experienced professionals. Educated. Careful. Competent. They simply shared something with the rest of us. They were human. And humans rely on shortcuts. Every day, your brain makes thousands of decisions. Too many to analyze one by one. So instead, it looks for signals. Does this person sound confident? Do they seem comfortable? Do others accept them? If enough answers are yes, trust often follows automatically. Demara didn't invent those mental shortcuts. He simply learned how to use them. One of the most powerful is something psychologists call the authority effect. When someone appears to hold a position of authority, people naturally give their words more weight. A doctor, a professor, a military officer, a government official. The title itself changes how we listen. The remarkable thing about Demara was that he understood the effect, even when the title wasn't real. Another lesson came from institutions themselves. Most organizations depend on cooperation. And cooperation depends on trust. Imagine verifying every diploma, every reference, every recommendation, every conversation. Nothing would ever get done. Trust makes society efficient. But efficiency comes with a cost. Occasionally, someone discovers how to exploit it. Demara wasn't the cause of that weakness. He was the proof that it existed. His story is still discussed in classrooms today. Not as a guide for deception. As a lesson in critical thinking. Question assumptions. Verify important information. Don't confuse confidence with competence. Because the two are not the same. Most of the time. They happen to appear together. Sometimes. They don't. That may be Ferdinand Demara's greatest contribution to history. He forced people to examine how they decide whom to trust. And once you begin asking that question, you start noticing it everywhere. In business. In politics. In medicine. On television. On social media. Every day, people present themselves as experts. Some truly are. Some are still learning. And a few are simply very convincing. The challenge is learning the difference. The name tag. Imagine attending a conference. Everyone is wearing a name tag. Some say, Doctor. Some say, Professor. Some say, Director. You meet someone whose badge reads, Senior Consultant. Immediately your conversation changes. You ask for advice. You listen more carefully. You assume they know what they're talking about. Now imagine the badge is wrong. Nothing about the person's appearance changed. Nothing about their voice changed. Only one word. Yet one word completely changed your expectations. That is the quiet power of authority. And Ferdinand Demara understood it better than almost anyone. By the end of his life, Ferdinand Demara had lived more lives than most people could imagine. Some were real. Most were borrowed. But the greatest irony was still waiting. Because despite becoming one of history's most famous impostors, his legacy was never really about deception. It was about belief. And that makes judging him far more complicated than it first appears. Chapter 8. The Man Who Became a Lesson. Ferdinand Demara eventually stopped making headlines. The disguises ended. The borrowed names disappeared. The impossible careers became memories. For the first time in decades, he lived a quieter life. There were no more hospitals. No more military uniforms. No more professors. No more sudden reinventions. The greatest impostor in history had finally run out of places to hide. Not because he lost the ability. Because the world now recognized his face. Ironically, success became his greatest obstacle. Every newspaper story, every magazine interview, every television appearance made the next impersonation less believable. The man who had spent years becoming everyone else could no longer escape being Ferdinand Demara. He died in 1982, leaving behind no empire, no fortune, no political movement, no institution that carried his name. Instead, he left behind stories. Stories so unbelievable that many people still assume they must be exaggerated. A fake monk, a fake prison official, a fake professor, a fake doctor, a fake naval surgeon. It sounds less like history and more like fiction. Yet much of it really happened. Today, Demara's story is still taught in discussions about psychology, leadership, security, human behavior. Not because people admire deception, because his life revealed uncomfortable truths about trust. He reminded us that credentials matter, but confidence matters too. Knowledge matters, but perception often arrives first. Institutions matter, but institutions are built by human beings, and human beings make assumptions. Those assumptions keep society moving. They also create blind spots. Demara didn't invent those blind spots. He simply wandered into them. Again. And again. Perhaps the strangest part of his legacy is that he rarely changed the systems he entered. He changed the people looking at them. After hearing his story, you begin asking different questions. How do I know this person is qualified? What evidence am I relying on? Am I trusting competence? Or confidence? Those questions remain just as relevant today. Perhaps even more relevant. In an age where anyone can build a convincing online identity, where expertise can be claimed with a profile picture, and authority can be manufactured in a matter of minutes, Ferdinand Demara feels surprisingly modern. Not because he predicted the future, because human nature hasn't changed very much. We still trust appearances. We still respond to confidence. We still assume someone else has already checked. That may be the greatest trick Ferdinand Demara ever performed. He convinced millions of people that his story was about one remarkable impostor, when in reality, it was about all of us. The mirror. Imagine standing in front of a mirror. You expect to see yourself. Instead, you see every role you've ever played. The employee, the student, the parent, the friend, the leader, the stranger. Each version is real. Yet none tells the whole story. Identity has always been more flexible than we'd like to admit. Most of us simply stay close to one version. Ferdinand Demara refused to choose. For better. And for worse. Most anti-heroes changed history by building something. An empire. An institution. A movement. Ferdinand Demara changed history by exposing something. A weakness. Not in governments. Not in hospitals. Not in universities. In human judgment itself. And that is where his story truly ends. Chapter 9. Genius, fraud, or something in between? Ferdinand Demara never built a criminal empire. He never controlled the government. He never reshaped an industry. Yet decades after his death, people still remember his name. That alone makes him unusual. Most impostors disappear once they're exposed. Demara became legendary. Not because he stole fortunes. Because he challenged one of our deepest assumptions. That people are who they say they are. His story forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. How often do we mistake confidence for competence? How often do we trust titles instead of evidence? How often do we believe someone simply because everyone else already does? Those questions have no easy answers. Perhaps that is why Demara's story has lasted for so long. Some people see him as a harmless trickster, an extraordinary storyteller who wandered through life collecting impossible experiences. Others see something far less charming, a man who repeatedly betrayed trust, who assumed responsibilities that were never his, who placed real people at real risk. Both perspectives contain truth. Because Ferdinand Demara was never easy to categorize. He was intelligent, curious, resourceful, funny, generous, according to many who knew him. He was also dishonest, reckless, and willing to cross lines that most people never would. That contradiction sits at the center of his legacy. Perhaps the greatest irony is this. Demara spent his life pretending to be other people. Yet in doing so, he revealed something authentic about everyone else. Our willingness to believe. Our reliance on appearances. Our desire to trust. He didn't create those instincts. He exposed them. And that may have been his greatest performance. Not convincing people he was someone else. Convincing us to examine how easily we believe. Today, his story feels more relevant than ever. Professional-looking websites. Convincing online profiles. Artificial intelligence. Digital identities. The tools have changed. Human psychology has not. We still judge confidence. We still follow authority. We still assume someone else has verified the facts. The stage is different. The audience is different. But the performance continues. So, was Ferdinand Demara a genius? A fraud? Or something in between? History has never reached a unanimous verdict. Perhaps it never will. Because the most fascinating anti-heroes are rarely remembered for the lives they lived. They're remembered for the questions they leave behind. And Ferdinand Demara leaves us with one that is impossible to ignore. If one man could become almost anyone, how certain are we that we truly know the people we trust?